After 12 years of wise and energetic leadership, Dr. John Carmody has retired from presidency of the Australian Catholic Historical Society. Happily, the Society will continue to enjoy speakers he recruits for the monthly program of talks. The ACHS has now elected Father Brian Lucas to be its president. Father Lucas spent 12 years as Secretary and Financial Administrator of the Archdiocese of Sydney and 13 years as the General Secretary of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. He's been a Churchill Fellow and has written extensively on church administration and pastoral matters. Father Lucas is currently the National Director of Catholic Mission, known more formally as the Pontifical Mission Societies. In this ACHS podcast for May 2024, we hear Father Lucas speaking about St Patrick's Estate, Manly, then and now. It's an ongoing story of transition, which begins in 1878, but in particular we hear how almost 30 years ago the Archdiocese of Sydney repurposed the estate's role on North Head, a work of great scale for Cardinal Clancy and his team, yet one in which even some bandy.
I lived at St Patrick's College, Manly for 3 years in the late 1970s when I was completing my seminary studies. And then in the 1990s, when Cardinal Clancy had appointed me as the Archdiocesan Secretary, I was heavily involved in the legal and technical issues involved in the relocation of the seminary from Manly to Strathfield, having access to all of the relevant material and the archives. And after 25 years, I thought it important perhaps to complete the record of that move and tell that story.
Before COVID, the Manly and Pittwater Historical Society had been in contact with Jim Franklin, wanting someone to give a presentation on the history of St Patrick's College, and you know what I'm talking about. And he asked me if I could do that. A couple of years ago I had published in the Australasian Catholic Record in 2 parts a more formal history of the estate. It was the 25th anniversary of Cardinal Clancy's decision to close the seminary and relocate it to Strathfield. So I published that with all the footnotes and whatever, so it wasn't a big ask to put it into a more popular form. But now 5 years later, it's about the 30th anniversary, and I thought this may be of some interest because people ask from time to time, what happened to the old seminary building at Manly? Does the church still own it? What's it used for? From time to time there are references in the paper to the leaseholds around Fairy Bower. So this presentation this afternoon might answer some of those questions. I was a student and resided at the college from the 1977, 78, 79. For those years I can speak from first-hand experience. In 1990, Cardinal Clancy appointed me as Archdiocesan Secretary, and with that role came the responsibility of implementing the Cardinal's 1993 decision to close the seminary and relocate to Strathfield, a project that took quite a number of years and was not without some controversy. So if we go now to the next slide.
2.
The definitive work on the site, on the history, is Kevin Walsh's book, Yesterday's Seminary, A History of St Patrick's College, Manly. Cardinal Clancy commissioned that to coincide with the relocation, and Dr. Walsh explains in the preface that he was given free rein, and he comments in passing that his sponsor was not so happy about the title, but it's a good title. This institution, as a seminary, does belong to a bygone era, and I'll explain that as we go. So for the early history, I'll draw on some of what Dr. Walsh wrote there, and there's also some references in Cardinal Moran's monumental history of the Catholic Church in Australasia. The original source material is vast, and the longevity of the Catholic Church is such that there's always been a traditional and significant investment in archives. Church law requires dioceses and other church entities to maintain an historical archive, and there's usually voluminous correspondence, mostly involving the hierarchy, and of course institutions such as St Patrick's commonly published magazines and annual reports, and the extensive footnoting in Dr. Walsh's book gives a taste for some of that material. For a timeline, I've conceptually divided the story into the middle, the beginning and the end. So we might have slide 3, the beginning, the English story, the Irish story and the Australian story. And then we've got the middle and the modern. So the first section is the English, the Irish and the Australian we'll come to. The modern is the relocation story that I'll tell you about. The middle was the change in church life at the time of the Second Vatican Council. So those first two Archbishops of Sydney, John Bean Paulding and Roger Bede Vaughan.
3.
As we know, were English Benedictines, and the standard histories of the Catholic Church, such as Patrick O'Farrell's Catholic Church and Community, talk about what they called the Benedictine dream and an expectation that the Church in Sydney and more widely would follow that monastic spirituality. But the tension between the English monastic hierarchy in the milieu of a Catholic population that was mostly Irish, that story has been told very thoroughly elsewhere. But both Archbishop Paulding and Archbishop Vaughan had a commitment to training local clergy, and that required a site and supporting finance. During a visit to Europe in 1846 to 1848, Archbishop Paulding sought support from the Society for the Propagation of the Faith in Lyon. And I note in passing that my organisation, Catholic Mission, is the Australian presence of that society. But he also included in his trip a trip to Whitehall to visit Earl Grey, the Secretary of State for the Colonies. And I've got in the written paper, you can read in the journal when it's published, some of the detail of the intrigue that went on between the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church and the government about various land grants. I won't go through all that detail now. Well, there was expectation of more land around Sydney University. At the end of the day, the Catholic Church was given 60 acres at North Head.
5.
That site plan of the site at Manly. So if you look at the very bottom left-hand corner, that's Spring Cove, that's the harbour, and it works its way through the suburbs to what is North Head up there to the right, and then the ocean at the very, very top. You can see the water going in there to Shelley Beach. It's alleged that Sir John Robertson, the Secretary of Lands, persuaded a very unsympathetic cabinet of the wisdom of the move, and this is the standard quote, pointing out it would set a protective barrier of Romanists between sundry foreign diseases and the rest of the population, because, in fact, right down the bottom there was the quarantine station. Archbishop Paulding's successor, Archbishop Vaughan, inherited a diocese that was in some administrative disarray, and the Manly property had been largely forgotten. A property at Glebe known as Lyndhurst had been provided for some seminary training. It wasn't suitable, and Archbishop Vaughan organised for it to be sold in 1878 and transferred the library to St John's College. But funds from the sale of the land and fixture was later used by Cardinal Moran for the building of St Patrick's College. There was still a need for a place of training of local clergy. Bathurst Diocese had set up a seminary in 1865 and was taking candidates from other dioceses. And there was a need for some more centralised and systematised national approach to clergy training. When he visited Rome in 1833, the officials there pressured Vaughan to establish a seminary in Sydney. He died in 1883, and the clerical students for Sydney were then studying at All Hallows. The Irish were now on their way. So we move to the Irish story. Cardinal Moran, nephew of Cullen, rector of the Irish College in Rome, later Archbishop of Dublin. He was ordained in 1853, Bishop of Ossory in 1872. Well connected and well known in Rome. And it's claimed that Pope Leo XIII personally intervened in Moran's appointment to Sydney in 1884 in the face of some English protestations. Anyway, Moran sailed into Sydney Harbour on the 8th of September 1884 to a well-orchestrated and rousing Irish welcome. He made St Mary's Cathedral his residence.
6.
You know those two statues, don't you, of course, outside St Mary's Cathedral. Moran didn't waste any time. he had a number of bishops in town for his arrival, and they went on a harbour cruise, as bishops sometimes do. A couple of times when I was secretary of the Bishops' Conference, when the bishops were in town, we took bishops on a harbour cruise. Anyway, on this particular day, they explored and inspected the church land and the quarantine station. And the local newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, reported that the Archbishop intended to build a summer residence on the Manly site and to construct there the diocesan seminary. He didn't waste time. The architectural firm Sheeran and Hennessy were consulted, and then within days he took a group of prominent Catholic laymen to walk the site, and then the fundraising began. Remember, he arrives in September 1884. In January 1885, contracts were signed for the Manly residence, a price of £9,000, and in April, a gathering of the clergy at St Mary's Hall, 80 priests saw the plans for the seminary. Its scale would have caused some alarm. The next slide.
7.
The Sydney Morning Herald regarded as likely to be one of the best examples of massive sandstone in the colony. I mean, that is a big building. The sandstone was quarried locally, and the building for the college was W.H. Jennings. The price, £60,000. Completion was estimated in 2.5 years. It would have the capacity for 200 students. Moran certainly had vision. Connected to his vision for the seminary was the convening of the first plenary council in Australia in 1885, and high on its agenda was the necessity for parishes to be staffed by secular clergy rather than members of religious orders, and to have a systematic approach to seminary education. Moran had in mind that Manly would be the national seminary. During the plenary council on Thursday, 19 November 1885, Moran and the other assembled bishops and what was described as a vast concourse of the faithful blessed the foundation stone. Next slide.
8.
There's just a reference there. The original grant of land went from the water to the harbour, but it was always anticipated that there would be a track from the village of Manly through to the quarantine station, and eventually what that street now known as Darley Road was resumed. But much more contentious was the expectation of the local community to have access to Shell Beach, what it was called then, now called Shelley Beach. Very soon after the announcement of the Manly plans in June 1885, the Sydney Morning Herald printed a letter from an anonymous correspondent on the subject of Shell Beach, proposing that the government reacquire at least 100 feet, or preferably 200 feet of the church's ocean frontage, to restore the whole seashore to the public. The Sydney Morning Herald argued that the grant should not have been given in the first place, that the beach was not necessary for ecclesiastics, whereas it was for the hundreds of thousands of citizens wanting to visit the beach. So public agitation began back then. But there was a reply. A prominent public service, J.J. Spruson, reminded the Herald's readers that the original grant of Manly land was to match the one the Anglican Church had received at Randwick. And he said the resumption of the one of the most attractive parts of the property would be a blow, and this was the quote, not only to the Catholics of New South Wales, I'm not quite sure how it's going to affect people in Broken Hill, but anyway, but to those of Australasia and the southern seas, given the future being planned for this great ecclesiastical centre. The Herald replied that this displayed, quotes, a great lack of charity on the Church's part. That theme will recur. In Moran's absence overseas, O'Haran prevailed on the Attorney-General and a prominent Catholic, William B. Daly, who you know. They inspected the college on horseback, called for the original grant papers, and at the end of July he told a formal deputation comprising Manly's mayor and several councillors that Shell Beach had been included in the grant conceded to the Catholic Church precisely to keep the quarantine area shut off from the public. It was not feasible now either to rescind the grant or repurchase the land. By this stage, Moran had been named a cardinal, and that gave a little bit of extra impetus to the Church's reaction to the conspiracy theories associated with the sectarianism of the time. But with the development of the Port Jackson Steamship Company and its rival, the cooperative company, more day trippers started to head for Fairy Bower. Fences were not a solution, and Moran came to look favourably on the prospect of an exchange of land. Eventually, with the backing of Manly Council and its mayor, the Cardinal agreed in principle to a land swap. The surveys were done in 1896. An additional area of land adjoining the quarantine reserve was added to the seminary site, and that involved the construction of a dividing wall. Cardinal Moran then set about expanding the seminary by purchasing some of the residential lots that came onto the market in the area bounded by Reddell Street and Addison Road. Other lots from the Vivian estate were later acquired, so eventually the seminary had land from Darley Road to the ocean on its western boundary. It secured its isolation and allowed for future expansion. The college opened its doors on the 23rd of January 1889. 5 students turned up that day. It was a big building to house 5 students. But by mid-year, the number had reached a very symbolic 12. Manly was to be an Australian seminary for Australian students, which brings us to the third part of the beginning, the Australian story. The next slide.
9.
From the very beginning, the college was well connected with the idea of an Australian nationalism, and Moran was a keen supporter of federation. The next slide.
10.
You can see there this idea of the nationalist aims. The blending of creed and country was a feature at the Jubilee, particularly because of a sermon delivered at the solemn opening Mass on 7 June 1914 at St Mary's Cathedral by Monsignor Maguire from Lismore. He identified religion and patriotism as the 2 great causes and told those celebrating its first 25 years that Manly College needs to be the nursery of both. From this central proposition, Maguire drew 2 stirring consequences for Manly men. One was it must become the Australian priesthood's national university in the course of the next 25 years, and the other was that more and more Australian young men were needed to swell their ranks. Words rendered of those used several years earlier by Bishop John Gallagher, the Irish Bishop of Goulburn. Maguire said that where previously the Church in Australia had relied principally on the Irish missioners, now the time had come when she must rely principally on the Australian priest. The graduates formed an association which came to be known as the Manly Union. They decided to publish an annual magazine, Manly, to publicise the cause of the development of the seminary to be the great national ecclesiastical university of the Commonwealth. That was the vision, but the idea that Manly would be a national seminary was fraught. Many of the Australian bishops, all but 3 of whom were Irish, were showing continuing indifference or even some hostility to the idea of native-born priests. Eventually Maguire became a bishop in Rockhampton, and the replacement of Romanised Irish bishops with Australian bishops was now well underway. But there was a tension between the Manly Union, the Australian priests and the Irish clergy, and we can't really go into the intricacies of all of that today. Suffice to say, eventually the Australian clergy superseded the Irish, and we have to face the reality today that the Australian are now being superseded by the Indian, Filipino and other overseas-born clergy. In Sydney, 53% of the clergy were born overseas from 43 different countries. That's the reality, which is not far off the number of Catholic people in the Archdiocese of Sydney who have an overseas heritage. So we're now at the end of the beginning. We now look at the middle years. This doesn't have a middle, beginning and end, but just a few brief words about the college's development up till 1993. A second seminary was opened in Springwood in the Blue Mountains in 1911. St Columba's College was a feeder college until the 2 were combined at Manly in 1978. The Manly Seminary did prosper and more space was needed. It never became the National Seminary because there were other seminaries opened in Melbourne and Brisbane and Perth and Adelaide in due course. But at a meeting of the Manly Union in 1929, the rector, Dr John Nevin, suggested a new chapel was required, and there was also a pressing need for a convent. Archbishop Kelly had established a small congregation of women religious, the Sisters of Our Lady Help of Christians, to assist with the staffing. Some land had been sold off on the edge of the estate in 1914 to raise funds for ongoing maintenance expenses. We'll come back to that. But notwithstanding the Depression, there was a substantial response from the Sydney parishes for an appeal to build a chapel. The next slide, Cardinal Soretti.
11.
Countess Freehill. She was the widow of solicitor Francis Bede Freehill from the law firm Freehill, Hollingdale and Page, now known as Herbert Smith's Freehill. She was a very generous benefactor, and she endowed a gift to promote the study of Italian at the University of Sydney, was very generous to St John's College and Westmead Boys' Home, and she gave a grant of £10,000 to start the National Chapel Appeal in 1933. That was 1/3 of the amount of the budget. It was prompted by Countess Freehill's respect for the papal legate, Cardinal Bonaventure Soretti, who along with his staff had resided in the family home of the Freehills in Sydney's Point Piper during the 1928 Eucharistic Congress. Soretti had been the papal legate for the Congress and became Australia's first apostolic delegate, a forerunner to an apostolic nuncio or ambassador of the Holy See. So naming the chapel in his honour seems somewhat odd until you understand the context of his involvement in the local church and his links to the international church. Archbishop Kelly gave a Sydney priest, Father Bill Clark, the task of visiting parishes and raising support. He had developed extraordinary skill as a fundraiser. He sold bricks and tiles and stones for many ecclesiastical buildings. Next slide.
12.
Buy a brick. By the time the fundraising for the chapel was completed, the appeal was oversubscribed to the tune of £5,000. Next slide.
13.
That is one of the fundraising events there, 2 photographs. My family folklore says that the gentleman in the very, very bottom left-hand corner in both photographs, in a suit with very white hair, is my grandfather, Victor Warwick. We found that photo, in fact, among his papers. There's a cropped version in the Walsh book, but the family folklore is that my grandfather, who was prominent in those sorts of events in those days, was there on that occasion. Next slide.
14.
That's the Soretti Chapel. It was a veneer construction, but the sandstone exterior made it resemble a made edifice. Hennessy and Hennessy, the successor firm of the original architects, commemorated their own 50th anniversary. So they'd been the original architects of the original building. So to commemorate the 50th anniversary, they offered to design this chapel for free of charge. Its architecture follows the monastic style of choir stalls. Next slide.
15.
And that's how the students worshipped when the chapel was originally constructed. As it happens, this is ideal for weddings, with the congregation now sitting opposite each other and they can watch the bride walk down the aisle. Next slide.
16.
One of my nieces decided to get married there, and it really is quite exquisite for weddings because you've got to have a good view of the bride. And you can see both sides there, and away they go. It was also the location for Nicole Kidman's wedding to Keith Urban, and also the backdrop for the movie The Great Gatsby. Try the next slide.
17.
You can see there the marquee that was built in the front of the college for Nicole Kidman's wedding, and that was the scene where they put in the artificial lake in front of the building for the movie The Great Gatsby. With an influx of students during the 1950s, the changes in church discipline, a new approach to the way in which seminary education was to be formed, required something different. The seminary had developed to the point where its academic excellence was recognised. It was an accredited faculty awarding pontifical degrees. A distinction then was made between the academic enterprise, the Catholic Institute of Sydney, and the seminary, St Patrick's College. Lay students were admitted, and in my time we had religious sisters and lay men and women join classes. The change with the Second Vatican Council and its impact on structures and formation would be a talk in itself. But to oversimplify, there was really a fundamental change from the mentality of a monastic isolation to a greater engagement with the world. An institutionalised discipline was relaxed, greater flexibility in the way seminary training was structured. The change of approach from a seminary in splendid isolation with formation oriented to protecting candidates from the evils of the world has been fully affirmed in the synthesis report of the Synod that's going on at the moment in Rome. The request has been widely expressed at this assembly, that's all of the bishops and other people gathered in Rome, that seminaries and other programs of priestly formation remain connected to the daily life of the community. So as more lay people look for the opportunity for theological education, particularly teachers in Catholic schools, it was more and more apparent Manly was not the right place. Geographically, it was isolated from the rest of the archdiocese, which stretches all the way out past Liverpool. The cost of maintenance of the sandstone buildings was astronomical. The humidity and salt spray put the library at risk, and there were fewer students. Now, just to set the context, after the papal visit in 1986, Cardinal Clancy began the work of rebuilding the Cathedral High School and the Cathedral Presbytery. When that was finished in 1991, he turned his mind to the difficulties I've just mentioned associated with the site of the seminary at Manly. In a style I think that would qualify today as a very, very good exercise in synodality, he consulted very widely. He assembled a group of about 50 lay people, clergy and religious, representing the various constituencies within the archdiocese. At the first meeting, he presented the problem and sent everyone away for a month to think about the issues, make inquiries and come back with solutions, which brings us now to our final part of the presentation, the modern period. We'll go to the next slide.
18.
These will be the themes that I'll discuss, and I'll just have a few words on each. The assessment of the site and environmental heritage issues. In 1986, Schwager Brooks had prepared an environmental investigation of the site. They made various recommendations and identified parcels of land that could be redeveloped for residential development. It also recommended archaeological investigation and a site management plan. So after Cardinal Clancy had come back with, had reassembled his group of people and they'd come back with ideas, the Archdiocese appointed Lend-Lease Property Services to coordinate the new investigations. But the more work that was done, the more complex the political and legal position began. The disciplines involved included property law, town planning, ecological conservation, heritage architecture, building code compliance, real estate valuation, actuarial analysis, and most complex of all, engagement in Manly local government politics. Lend-Lease established a project control group with their own experts, and in fact it was chaired by the then Lend-Lease Managing Director, David Higgins. That's how seriously Lend-Lease took this particular project and how engaged they become. And from time to time, Cardinal Clancy would attend those meetings. At an early stage, legal advice was provided by one of the leaders in planning and environment law, Murray Wilcox. Acting on his advice, a team of experts was assembled, and the idea was to make sure you hired the experts first before the council had a chance to hire experts on their side, and that's what we were able successfully to do. Howard Tanner was appointed the heritage architect. Among the work that had built his reputation was the restoration work on the Sydney Town Hall. So we go now to the next slide.
19.
These are all of the various experts that all had to be engaged. I didn't know there were people who were experts on trees, but there was also, if you look down the very bottom, the second last one, visual impact. Richard Lamb from Lamb Common Associates is an expert on visual impact. In the course of, we'll come to it in a moment, the Land Environment Court, we all went up there to Harbord and they had balloons on the site showing where buildings would be, and he gave this expert evidence about the impact of different buildings on the visual integrity. And all of that, as you can imagine, came at some considerable cost. At an early stage, it was well understood that the various suggestions to use the site for some form of social welfare project, one of the suggestions was a rehabilitation centre for those people with drug dependency. That was unlikely either to be feasible commercially or acceptable to the local community. In fact, nothing was acceptable to the local community. And I'd heard the expression a NIMBY, you know, if you've heard of a NIMBY, not in my backyard. Well, a new expression emerged called a banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. There was a certain openness to aged care and child care. But one of the members of the Archdiocesan Finance Committee was very explicit. You cannot put low-cost housing on high-cost land. So the general feeling was that the best use of the buildings and land would be to generate revenue that could be used elsewhere in furtherance of the Archdiocese's mission. So part of it involved residential development. Part of the land near the bottom oval and on the harbour side in front of the building known as the Archbishop's Residence had been rezoned in 1986 for residential use. But zoning was not going to be definitive, as other planning requirements would still have to be met. So we moved to the Land and Environment Court litigation. Next slide.
20.
Manly Council did not resolve the development application within the prescribed time, so the Archdiocese had to proceed to court on the basis of what is called a deemed refusal. The first hearing before the Chief Judge of the Land and Environment Court, Justice Marla Pearlman, took 1 month. She gave her judgment on the 26th of February 1987. She rejected some of the development on the Gilroy House side and on the bottom oval, but allowed a development of 56 dwellings opposite the hospital at the top of Bower Street. In the light of her observations on the other part she rejected, new plans were presented to Manly Council and they rejected all of that as well. Justice Lloyd presided over a further appeal by the Archdiocese, and he gave a judgment on the 30th of June 1998 allowing all the new development of the Archdiocese proposed on the north side of Darley Road and dealt with the substantive issues on the south side. Peter McClellan, who became famous for the Royal Commission, was acting for Manly Council in that particular hearing, and Justice Spiegelman was his last case before he was appointed Chief Justice of the New South Wales Supreme Court, acted for the Archdiocese. The problem with the bandicoots. Next slide.
21.
There was a population of long-nosed bandicoots on North Head. The Manly contention was that the proposed development by the Archdiocese would in effect be fatal to this threatened population. On the first day of the hearing in the Land Environment Court, counsel for the council, Jeremy Bingham on that occasion, he was a previous Lord Mayor of Sydney, he opened his address to Her Honour Marla Pearlman by handing up an extract from Norman Lindsay's The Magic Pudding. Next slide.
22.
I'll read it for you. The next person they spied was a bandicoot carrying a watermelon. At first glance you would have thought it was merely a watermelon walking by itself, but a second glance would have shown you that the walking was being done by a small pair of legs attached to the watermelon, and a third glance would have disclosed that the legs were attached to a bandicoot. They shouted, "Hey, you with the melon," to attract his attention and set off running after him. And the bandicoot, being naturally of a terrified disposition, ran for all he was worth. He wasn't worth much as a runner, owing to the weight of the watermelon. And they caught up with him halfway across the field. Conceiving that his hour had come, the bandicoot gave a shrill squeak of terror and fell on his knees. "Take my watermelon," he gasped, "but spare my life." That was somewhat perplexing for Her Honour as Jeremy Bingham read that passage. But the demonstrators outside in Macquarie Street, they knew what they were doing. And they had placards with images of dying bandicoots. And some months later, when the judgment was given, the Manly Daily ran a cartoon featuring the bandicoot. The next slide.
23.
That was the cartoon in the Manly Daily. Just as an aside, when the relatives of Justice Pearlman, after she died, were dealing with her personal effects, they found this cartoon, which she had taken and framed among her personal papers. They gave it to Justice Terry Sheehan, who was then on the Land and Environment Court, who in turn handed it over to Malcolm Craig, KC, who was the church's barrister. As a further aside, Len Lease made a number of pewter bandicoots as mementos for the team involved in the proceedings. We all got given a little pewter bandicoot. The problem with the bandicoots was not that they were a threatened species, but legislation recognised risk to populations. So detailed studies were commissioned by both parties about these bandicoots. The bandicoots were captured and fixed with radio tracking devices to record their movements. including their movements through the holes in the wall that divided the seminary from North Head. And the Army Reserve on North Head. It was agreed that there were 120 bandicoots in total on North Head. That was common ground, they'd counted them. St Patrick's estate was roughly 10% of North Head, which brings us down to 12 bandicoots. And the area of the estate that was the object of development was about 10% of the St Patrick's estate. So at risk were 1.2 bandicoots. Eventually rationality prevailed, and with various conditions attaching to approval requiring vegetation corridors to be developed through the site to allow the movement of bandicoots, and there were restrictions on cats and dogs, traffic calming and the like. The real risk, of course, came from outside the estate, namely the feral predators, foxes and domestic cats. So that was the bandicoot story. Spare my life, says the bandicoot. By public advertisement, then, the Archdiocese sought expressions of interest for possible uses of the main building, Moore and House. In response, an executive of a tourism enterprise made an approach and shared the vision of using the building for a college for training and hospitality. From that approach, the lease to the International College of Management developed. Next slide.
24.
And that company is still the current tenant. The proposed use was compatible with the zoning. The seminary site had been zoned for seminary use. And legal advice confirmed that the meaning of seminary was broader than simply ecclesiastical studies. As you would know, Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado had referred to a ladies' seminary. So we got through that problem. A college for students to pursue hospitality management clearly fitted the zoning, but a development application was still required for the works connected with the change of occupant. That ran into difficulties, but the principles of that hospitality business were well connected politically, and eventually they were able to get approval. Extensive building works were required to ensure the old buildings were compliant with fire and modern access requirements and the like. So concurrent with those two contracts, the tenant had a fit-out. Lend-Lease managed the project of 3 concurrent building projects, and the work was completed without any significant disputation. They appointed a firm of quantity surveyors, and everyone agreed that their decision as to whether this particular bit of work fitted into which contract would be definitive. And symbolically, Lend-Lease in the workers' shed had 2 safety helmets, one marked Cardinal Clancy, one marked Father Lucas, and those helmets were there for no other purpose than, I think, to make everyone feel good. Anyway, the college opened its doors in May 1996 with 53 students studying a diploma in hotel management and a handful of staff. We come now to the Bower Street leaseholds. From 1913, there had been moves to obtain government approval for the sale of part of the land granted to the church. An enabling Act of Parliament was necessary, and that was eventually assented to in April 1914. Some of the land was then subdivided around the walkway to what became known as Shelley Beach. And fortuitously, in hindsight, pressure from the local council restricted the sale of that land to leasehold. The thinking being to suppress the price for the benefit of returned servicemen. Next slide.
25.
You can see there the college, and you can see all of those houses around the waterfront. There are 3 rows of houses. The back row are the newer ones that came after the court case with the Land and Environment Court, and the development on the right-hand side of the slide behind the college is also the new development. But those first 2 rows of houses on either side of Bower Street were part of those original sale. So over the years that followed, Manly became more and more attractive as a residential suburb, and the owners built more and more elaborate residences on Bower Street, which had an unparalleled ocean view to the north. A local agent described the street as the Point Piper of the Northern Beaches. By the mid-1990s, though, when the Archdiocese was in full flight in dealing with the proposed move of the seminary, and the subdivision of some of the other vacant land, the Bower Street leaseholders were wondering about their future. Now, somewhat naively, as it turned out, the Archdiocesan advisors hoped that if we could have suitable arrangements with them for the extension of their leases, this group of neighbours might support the other proposals. That was a forlorn hope. Nevertheless, it was becoming quite apparent that at some point the Archdiocese needed to take a decision as to what to do with these leaseholds. At that stage, they only had about 19 years to run. Various options were considered. One view was to simply sell up the entire estate to a congregate buyer, say a managed fund, take the money, invest it and walk away. Another view was to sell the freehold to the leaseholders. Both those options were unacceptable because at this stage the proceeds didn't really reflect the Archdiocesan long-term interest. The problem was the relative worth of the tenant's interest and the Archdiocesan reversionary interest. You might say on a 99-year lease, hypothetically, at year 1 the tenant owns everything, and at year 100 the Archdiocese owns everything. And so at the 50% mark, 50 years in, you own half each. But that's not how the market works. With 20 to 25 years left, the leaseholds had been changing hands at virtually 100% of the freehold value. For example, on the 4th of July 1998, a property with only 17 years to run sold for $1.1 million. There was recently a sale, again, of leasehold land on that street for upwards of $25 million. So there'd be a point, of course, when the properties would lose all their value because no purchaser would come into a market because the time remaining would be too short. But no one knew when that point of no return would be reached. With the tenant having most of the equity in the property, the sale of an additional 99 years lease to the tenant or reversionary interest to the third party would not give the Archdiocesan a fair return. So Lend-Lease recruited their actuaries. At that time they owned MLC and they co-opted their actuaries, and Collier's Jardine were co-opted as the valuers, and it was a real conundrum, went to many, many meetings. The Archdiocese couldn't walk away from the fact that in 19 years or so it would in effect own the full value of 75 extremely valuable properties. Yet the political fallout from advising the leaseholders that the Archdiocese would allow the leases to expire was a major risk, and the idea that people would leave their homes was untenable. There'd been talk of special legislation to nullify the Archdiocesan interest. The local member there, Peter MacDonald, independent, wanted the government to pass law to turn those leaseholds into freehold. This was a bit unconscionable for the state government because it had all this 99-year lease property that it owned down in the rocks, so it could hardly change the rules for us and not for itself. The other risk was if we waited for the tipping point, the properties would be at risk of deterioration. Anyway, hours and hours of meeting failed to find a way forward. And then sometimes the most complex things can be resolved in the most simple way. One of the leaseholders made a phone call. He said that his business was good, but he could never afford a mortgage if he had to repurchase his property when the lease ran out. He wondered if he could buy a shorter extension for less money, and that was the stroke of genius that the actuaries had not ever directed their minds to. The way forward was then to give all of the leaseholders an option to extend their lease at that stage for 17 years, and they would pay for it now for 20% of the current value. And they were given a series of 3 further options on the same terms. That gave the Archdiocesan some money, and there would be this period of constant future renewals. There was a meeting of a group of the tenants. They turned up and we had our people at this evening meeting. Anyway, it was a fairly tense standoff, and the leaseholders had all received the letter about what the offer was, and they said that the Archdiocese were rapacious and greedy and this was unconscionable and a ridiculous offer and so on. So we said, well, is the problem the structure or the price? Oh no, the structure they thought was brilliant. This idea of having renewals was a great idea. It was the price. Well, what's wrong with the price? Well, what do you think it should be? We said 20%, they said 10%. Well, we'd based ours on the 30-year discount rate. they had nowhere to move in terms of any official criterion. So we told them to go away and get some advice. They went away and got advice to find out that the precise amount, in fact, was 22%. So they were getting a 10% discount. And one of them put his property on the market, and when the auctioneer announced that he had made arrangements with the church, 73 of the 75 folded one by one. The offer said no one had to leave, they could all stay there as their principal place of residence and do nothing and stay on a commercial rent. But anyway, as one would expect, when the offer went to the tenants, it was leaked to the media. Robert Wainwright in the Sydney Morning Herald wrote a story under the headline, "Peppercorn Rents, Parties Over on Millionaires Row." And as I said, Dr McDonald, the local member, tried to invoke the Residential Tenancies Act, said there was collusion between the Archdiocese and the state government, which the Department of Fair Trading spokesman said was bizarre and untrue. I've got some technical details about how it all came to be, but at the end of the day, it has become a very fair outcome both for the tenants, who can choose how long they wish to renew and pay a price accordingly, and is a steady cash flow for the Archdiocese. When the advertisement was placed for expressions of interest in the use of the Manly buildings, Dr Michael Stevens, paediatric oncologist at Westmead Hospital, rang me. I knew him as a parishioner at St Michael's Lane Cove. I used to play the organ there. And he was a driving force in the establishment of what came to be known as Bear Cottage. When he made the initial approach, he was thinking of the big building, but it was obvious that would not meet Bear Cottage's needs. But the outcome of the phone conversation was an undertaking that I would discuss it with Cardinal Clancy, whether some portion of the land might be available and suitable for their venture. Cardinal Clancy was very enthusiastic about finding a solution and open to the possibility, so we explored various options. And there was a parcel of land as you come in the gates from Darley Road to the left-hand side. It was called the Grotto. Some of you may remember, if you went to Corpus Christi processions at Manly back in the 1960s, that's where they used to have the benediction. It was the right size and eminently suitable for development, and the Archdiocese was willing to make that site available on a nominal basis for the Children's Hospital to construct a purpose-built facility. But of course that required Manly Council approval, and the council had a problem because those bandicoots had not gone away. I could hardly give approval when it was strenuously opposing us and fighting us in the Land and Environment Court. Anyway, there was a very high-profile public campaign in support of Bear Cottage. Alan Jones, you know, as a radio presenter, he weighed into it, and eventually the state government intervened as well. Eventually, after the Archdiocese had some success in its court proceedings, Manly Council eventually approved the development of Bear Cottage in 1997. There was an article in the Northern Beaches Weekend which summarised their journey to Manly. The hospital has searched extensively throughout the Sydney area, and the St Patrick's site is the only one to meet the criteria for a children's hospice, peace and tranquility, yet close to recreation, entertainment, shopping and public transport. It was officially opened on St Patrick's Day 2001. Next slide.
26.
And it received its first families in May 2001. It had its own separate entrance too, which was particularly attractive. And I think that aspect of the story of St Patrick's is the one for which I am most proud. So while all this was happening at Manly, a concurrent story was the development of the new seminary at Homebush, new premises for the Catholic Institute of Sydney and Albert Road, and that's a story for another day. Next slide.
27.
I'm happy if you have any questions or discussion. Yes, Di.
As a social worker at the Children's Hospital, I have been to Bear Cottage many times. I have to say it is the most marvellous arrangement to have there, and it's a hospice for children, not just from our hospital, from John Hunter Hospital and what used to be Randwick, but is now part of the Sydney Children's Hospital network. But it just makes such a difference to families. But you mentioned the Grotto.
Yes.
And the parents and the kids and the siblings are often outside, and they're all, what's that lady doing? What? But they love it. They really like the grotto.
Yes.
But they talk about it a lot. The other thing is, I have to say that the seminary building itself, the people there are so good to the families at Bear Cottage. They do special dinners for families. They allow us to use rooms up there to run groups for families. We run groups for brothers and sisters of children who are dying or children who have died. We also run groups for parents that are currently there with their very sick children. But what it does, it's really the best, is when a child actually dies at Bear Cottage, and they've also got a room where the child can stay there for. It's especially has special refrigeration so that they can leave the child there for a day or two rather than have to move to a mortuary until the funeral is organised. So everything has worked out so well, and they are very, very grateful to Michael Stevens, who was a marvellous oncologist who I worked with for many years before he retired, and to the Archdiocese for agreeing to having Bear Cottage set up there.
No, it really was a wonderful project, and the way the students at the Hospitality College also fitted into the Manly community. The whole site. When you think of the aggravation that was there at the beginning, and how much it now contributes to the whole Manly community, it's really chalk and cheese.
The community supports Bear
Cottage
so much too. A lot of volunteers from Manly go there.
They do.
Play with the children, help the children. Yeah.
And they sell lamingtons along the walkway. Sometimes I go for a ferry ride to Manly. That's one of my favourite beaches. And walking along that walkway between Manly Beach and Shelley Beach, and there's some little kids selling lamingtons for Bear Cottage. Well, you had to, didn't you? Yeah. Other questions?
Just a question. Did Manly Council, was their main objection to the additional residential properties, or were they just objecting because they don't like change?
It was an objection to the residential properties.
The additional.
Even though it was zoned residential. Yeah. So they couldn't complain about residential, so they used questions of views. It would destroy the impact of the view on the historical building. The destruction of the Bandicoot colony, we went through that in excruciating detail. And there was also a number of other objections. Seagrass in the Manly Cove, on the harbour side, there's seagrass down there, and that was going to be put at risk because of water runoff. Traffic, of course, everyone complains about traffic. And one of the other objections was there's a colony of fairy penguins near the quarantine station, and they were going to be destroyed. It went for a month, let me tell you. This was quite some business. That was the first hearing. There was a very, very prominent environmental activist who gave evidence in the second hearing in front of Justice Lloyd, and we had Spiegelman as our senior counsel, and he was cross-examining this environmentalist who'd written the report for Manly Council. And I don't remember exactly the words, but this was the tenor of the cross-examination. So, Dr. X, you thoroughly studied this site before you wrote your report, yes. And in the course of that thorough investigation, you read all of the relevant material that's been written on the site, yes. And that included, you have read, in fact, the report of the church's expert, and there was just that scintillating hesitancy that the cross-examiner is looking for. Yes, I'm aware of that report. No, that's not the question. Did you read that report? Parts of it. Which parts of it? And it was a complete and utter demolition of this very prominent environmental activist that you still see on television. He was the hired gun, not thinking that it would be put under scrutiny. But it was a very, very thoroughly fought out issue between the church and the council at the legal level. At the political level, I addressed 2 public meetings at Manly, and you saw the cartoon, he was stabbing the bandicoot. But look, when you think now, 30 years later, I think as Di said so beautifully, I mean, it's a wonderful use of the site and is causing none of the problems that... What helped a little bit with the bandicoots towards the end was that the mayor's granddaughter lived in one of the leaseholds and got a tick infection that had been attributed to a bandicoot, so that helped move some of the politics a little bit. Questions?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Brian. That was very interesting. Just to ask, so the College of Hospitality, I understand that's a leasehold from the Archdiocese. So is there the expectation that will continue indefinitely to the satisfaction of both sides?
I presume while both sides are happy, it'll continue. I mean, obviously, the principles of the Hospitality College will not live forever, but they've been there now nigh on 30 years, and it has expanded significantly, moving from hospitality to management in general, and they've got tertiary accreditation in various levels, and they have a lot of property in Manly itself where they've expanded for residential. They hit the jackpot when they discovered that Norway would give a scholarship to students to go and study something overseas. So you can imagine that, the photo of Manly and the Manly beach. And he went off to Norway, and he had all these Norwegian students coming out, of course, who had good English anyway. And
Germany has some sort of thing like that too. But what about the other side? What about the Cardinal's residence side?
Yeah,
you didn't speak about that much.
I didn't speak about that much because that all happened after I'd left the Archdiocese. There's St Paul's High School, and then there was the old building that was called the Archbishop's Residence that became part of the school. It was called the Palace, yes, because some people used to call it the big building, Moran House, the Cardinal's Palace too. But and then there was another modern building, when I say modern, 1960s building for postgraduate students between there and the water. The Archdiocese had given the water frontage back to the council, but there was land there zoned residential. It took a long time to get the approvals for that, but eventually the Archdiocese, and that's all been developed now as residential. Leasehold, yes. All leasehold. All the new development is all leasehold as well. Other questions? I've gone way over time from a normal meeting. It's a bad start for a new president, but I'm sorry about that. Yes?
Loved listening to all you'd said, and I've travelled to Manly on many an occasion, saw the imposing buildings, learned the transition to the international hospitality. The one thing I remember, the imposing building, and the fact that Tony Abbott had been there for 3 years, I believe. Did his presence in Manly have any impact on him in his later life?
I don't know. Tony Abbott came to study there after I had left there.
1984, I think it was.
I was already ordained
okay.
by the time he came there as a student, so I can't really comment on his time there at all.
But I didn't realise that it was on lease and that the church still held the...
Yes.
Because I was concerned, I said, what a disappointment if it was sold, it would be lost forever.
No.
And I didn't know the history, and such a fascinating history. I look forward to listening to the podcast when it's available. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Frank Duff, Diocese of Parramatta, Parish of Parramatta, some scuttlebutt. Dr. John DeLuca, RIP, was always very upset about the archives of the Archdiocese. At the time, the crypt of St Mary's Cathedral at the southern end was full of junk, and we was told it was going to be junked unless it was retained. There were 5 boxes of music, tea chests full of music, which I physically transported to Manly and eventually got from Manly St Patrick's via Mary MacKillop, North Sydney. Eventually went to St Pat's and has finally gone to CIS at Strathfield, so that's now saved. We also got the mechanism of pipe organ. It came to my place until my wife turped it out and it went back to John DeLuca at Lura. I don't know where it is still. Finally, the Soretti Chapel. There is a Cardinal Soretti throne, which I have. Well, the Knights of the Southern Cross. It was their chairman's chair. It was used in 1928. The Archdiocese and Archivist and the Chancery thought it belonged to them. It doesn't. It belongs to us, the Knights of the Southern Cross. It is currently on the Sanctuary of St Michael's at Rookwood. And finally, the chapel organ in Cerretti Chapel, it's a beast of a thing. I played it once for Cardinal Clancy, and the entire swell manual didn't work. So what did I do? I turned it off and turned it on again, and then it worked. Thank you.
Very good.
I think everybody here is too young for this, but I'm wondering if there is anyone at all who used to go into the Eucharistic processions at Manly, at the seminary. Yes. So they were a big feature, I think, of Catholic life at that time, the processions in the seminary. And the other day I read somewhere that this is an age of processions now. They were commenting on a recent one, I think. So I was interested in that because someone said they're out of date now. Anyone who was here at those processions?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Tony Abbott was a student at St Patrick's College, Manly, but a more important figure was the Australian novelist Tom Keneally, who now lives on the site in those buildings behind the old college. That's where Tom Keneally lives now, wrestling with his demons.
He wrote, I think the book was a place at Whitman, I think, was focused particularly on the college, and of course his other works, Three Cheers for the Prayer. I used to enjoy his writings, I must say.
Brian, maybe just to follow up the question about the processions, I recall going to Corpus Christi processions on the Manly property, as my wife did, obviously long before we met, and she has a recollection of, she was in the Czech-speaking community, and the Polish-speaking community carried a set of rosary beads, and each bead was pretty much as big as a bowling ball, apparently, and each was carried by another young girl or boy. Just part of the piety of the time that many people will remember. Thank you.
You said there's a passageway, a special passageway allowed for the bandicoots. Was
yes.
Passed through? Was it bitumen or
no.
So that they knew.
In between where the new buildings were positioned in that third row of houses, and following on from the holes in the wall. So the bandicoots are on one side of the wall and the college is on the other side, but the wall had holes in it.
Okay.
And so the bandicoots, there was some wonderful cross-examination about this, because trying to ask the expert, now when the bandicoot comes through the hole, how does the bandicoot know whether to go left or right? And it was amazing stuff that went on. But they had to have vegetation corridors with grass so high. They had to be kept so high so the bandicoots could find their way right through the property and go down and infect the mayor's granddaughter with a tick. So,
were there any cameras installed to monitor the traffic?
No, there weren't cameras. They had radio tracking devices attached to them. They caught the bandicoots and put this little radio tracking thing around their neck.
Oh, okay.
And then they follow somehow or another where these bandicoots go and how many go and what they do. Because they're nocturnal, you see.
Yeah, of course.
So,
thank you. Thanks very much.
What I know about bandicoots serves me in good stead, Jack.
Ed, this is some important anniversary of The Place at Witness. Is it the 50th anniversary of the publication of that book?
Oh, yeah, 60.
60.
A publisher rang me up a couple of months ago and said, do you know that it's Tom Keneally's 60th? He published it 60 years ago, the first book on Manly Seminary. He wrote 2 novels about Manly Seminary. And we want you to come down to the Adelaide Festival, the Writers' Festival, still the best of Writers' Festival in Australia. And I said, no, I'm 90 now. I don't travel much at all. And she said, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll send out a photographer and you can do a podcast. And so I wrote about the 5 minutes, a 5-minute snippet for the Adelaide Writers' Festival earlier this year. And Tom's grandson came out with the camera, and I noticed that his equipment was still in its packaging. So I wasn't really surprised when he rang me back 3 days later and said, "I'm sorry, I failed to turn the sound on." So I had to do it again. And I've never seen the podcast, but yes, I think they're doing further editions of those novels.
And talking of anniversaries, what did you tell me? The anniversary of the Council of Nicaea?
Next year.
Next year, that's right.
700 years of the Council. We got an historian who's got any contemporary knowledge of the Council of Nicaea. So.
We have a geriatric problem, Brian, as you will discover, but it's not as bad as that.
Let's share some fellowship with a cup of tea. Thank you for your attendance here. I am an apology for the June meeting because of commitments overseas. So I think Jim or someone will look after the June meeting.
We've been listening to Father Brian Lucas speaking at the May 2024 meeting of the Australian Catholic Historical Society about St Patrick's Estate, Manly. A more formal version of this talk, his personal history of moving a seminary, was published in the Australasian Catholic Record, Volume 96, Issues 2 and 3 in April and July of 2019. Kevin J. Walsh's history of St Patrick's Manly, Yesterday's Seminary, was published in 1998 by Allen and Unwin. And we can learn more about life at Bear Cottage by visiting the Bear Cottage website. Australian Catholic Historical Society meetings are held at 2 p.m. on the third Sunday of each month from February to November in the Crypt of St Patrick's, Churchill, 20 Grosvenor Street, Sydney. Please visit the ACHS website for our 2024 Talks program. Our meeting and podcast speaker for June 2024 is Dr. Julie Thorpe, speaking about Seven Hill, a living archive. ACHS podcasts are produced by me, John Kenny. The Society acknowledges the traditional custodians of Gadigal country where this talk was given, of Wallamatigal country where I make the podcasts, and of all the places in which our stream may be heard. We're looking forward to being with you each month. Bye for now.